Hello and welcome to the Intellect's Cove. I'm Colin Farrelly. I'm a pragmatist philosopher and political theorist based at Queen's University in Canada. And this is going to be the second video from chapter 5 of my book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science. In the first video, we looked at the first, what I call folkbiological premise of early 20th century public health pioneers like Charles Winslow and Herman Biggs, which presumed that health is the normal condition of the human mechanism and disease is unnecessary. Now, that presumption has greater validity if we're only looking at humans in the first few decades of life. But if we look at the whole lifespan for humans, especially beyond the seventh decade of life, we see that the onset of disease, frailty, and disability is part of the lifespan for humans, and we need to understand what biological aging is and why aging leaves us vulnerable to the onset of disease in later life. And so we can abate that first biological premise by taking seriously insights from Geroscience, that is an interdisciplinary approach that looks at the role of genetic, environmental, lifestyle, and pharmacological factors that influence the onset of disease, frailty, and disability in the adult lifespan. In this video, I'm going to focus on the second presumption of folk biology that we can find in early public health pioneers, and that was the assumption of epidemiology that it's only the proximate causes of disease that are modifiable, rather than the evolutionary causation of disease, which is what Geroscience helps to illuminate. And in the third video, I'll look at the belief that the rate of biological aging is universal, something that is also now being refuted and has big implications for what we take the aspiration of rate control to be in the 21st century. So just a reminder on what folk biology is, I utilized the definition by Scott Antrim and Douglas Medin in Folk Biology, that it's our everyday understanding of the biological world, even those that may contain some rudimentary or more sophisticated scientific concepts. And as I argued in the last video, the war against disease frame that Winslow advanced helped abate dominant folk biological premises of his contemporaries, and in particular the belief that the onset that infectious diseases were in some sense part of some divine plan that a deity had for the population, and instead to get a more scientifically accurate understanding of our susceptibility to infectious diseases. So Winslow and Biggs and other public health pioneers helped challenge as well as perpetuated folk biological beliefs about disease. And as I noted in the last video, one of the big beliefs that Winslow advocated that had to be abated was the presumption that infectious disease mortality amongst the young was somehow a compassionate God intervening to alleviate the economic burdens of the poor, rather than a reality of the world's extrinsic risk factors that could be abated through improvements in hygiene and living conditions. So that is the strength of it. It helped the steamship of modern public health be created and make progress, adding decades of healthy life to the world's younger populations up until the 21st century, when we see a growing disparity between health span and lifespan, especially in those regions of the world where the population is surviving past the seventh decade of life. But the downside is that it blinded us to the biology of aging and recognizing that the aging process itself is implicated in the most common chronic conditions that are now responsible for mortality in the world in the 21st century. And that is what I'm going to unpack in a little bit more detail in this video. So the initial presuppositions of public health pioneers, the war against disease, was crafted to address the problem of high rates of early life mortality from infectious disease and poverty, right? So a couple of the diseases here: smallpox, estimated to kill about 500 million people in the 20th century alone, and is the only disease to be eliminated through vaccination in 1980. But rabies, polio, cholera, tuberculosis, and demographers debated what the future for human longevity would look like as these early rates of mortality were abated. Would it be smoother sailing once you escaped the onset of the waves of infectious disease? And these intellectual presuppositions wouldn't constrain us so much if the future was smooth sailing. But as I covered in a previous video, one of the three scientific disputes that has been resolved in the late 20th century and into the 21st century was the dispute about what would happen to human longevity through the 21st century. This was captured in a great piece in Science called A Pitched Battle Over Lifespan over 10 years ago between Geroscience and James Voppel, the statistician approach that argued that if you made 30 years of increase in life expectancy in the 20th century, you could infer another 30 years of increase in life expectancy for the 21st century. And then the realist camp, represented by Olshansky, that argued that biology trumps math. Saving the young confers much more life expectancy and healthy life expectancy than trying to save an older person from just one chronic condition when they are highly vulnerable to developing other chronic conditions, even if you save them from a particular type of cancer. So there is a biological limit to human longevity, and more important to healthy longevity, and that has meant that the steamship of modern public health has faced an onset of chronic conditions, more and more waves of chronic disease as the population survived past the 7th decade of life. So in the tail of the journey through the ocean of longevity, I describe how the captain of the ship is notified that the iceberg is responsible for the onset of these chronic conditions. And so that is the first step, is the resolution of the dispute that demographers had about whether or not the future would be smooth sailing for human populations or whether we'd face the onset of more chronic conditions. The older populations survived. And that is now demonstrably proven to be the case, that older populations face a plurality of health maladies as they get older. And then the second insight in that tale is when the engineers note that actually, while it's not going to be possible to eradicate the iceberg, they could deploy a missile that would push the iceberg back, thereby reducing the intensity and prevalence of the waves of chronic disease, right? And this is the ideal of rate control, that we can intentionally slow the rate of aging through non-pharmacological and even pharmacological means to increase health span and compress morbidity and frailty and disability in late life. And that is what the aspiration of the Geroscience hypothesis is proposing, that we can target aging with drugs to boost our biological resilience to the onset of poor health in late life. So I summarize this. The central goal of my book is to really facilitate deliberation and debate on what I call the mandate of wisdom, inquiry, longevity science. What do we want the steamship of modern public health to achieve? Is it simply about delaying death into later life while older cohorts manage multimorbidity, frailty, and disability, and more adult children are providing care for their parents who are surviving longer after the health span has expired? And I don't believe that that's the morally laudable aspiration, but I pose it as a question and I conjecture towards some potential answers. What should the ultimate destination of the vessel of modern public health be? Is it just increasing life expectancy or increasing healthy life expectancy, a reduction in health disparities, a good death, all of the above, something else? I advocate towards certain tentative answers to increase the quality of our deliberations and debate on these topics, and then what needs to be done now to ensure our safe and expeditious arrival at number one. So remember, I'm a pragmatist philosopher. I want our focus to be on how the beliefs and aspirations we have translate into action in the here and now. And as I'll unpack in future chapters, this involves addressing both the non-pharmacological factors that influence the rate of aging, such as exercise, diet, the social determinants of health, the environments in which we live, but also the development of geroprotective drugs that will help boost our biological resilience to the onset of chronic disease in late life. So to pick up the thread from the last video, I argued that there are many benefits of the intellectual presuppositions of epidemiology and sanitation science that helped us realize the strategy of the war against disease. But it also has some setbacks. It also has some shortcomings with respect to how it can address the challenges of population aging in the 21st century. And in particular, its fixation only on ameliorating the proximate causation of disease. And so let me just unpack this a little bit. One of the things that Winslow and Biggs helped open our eyes to is the plurality of extrinsic risk factors that are responsible for disease and death, right? And for most of our evolutionary history, we weren't aware of these. Many of these risk factors are not perceivable to the five senses, right? So people would be drinking water, not realizing that there's bacteria in the water that can prove fatal. But with the rise of epidemiology, we've been able to identify a whole host of extrinsic risk factors that contribute to our risk of disease and death, from viruses and bacteria to malaria, smoking, alcohol, UV rays, poverty, automobile accidents. So this has been a monumental achievement for public health, is that to open our eyes to the plurality of extrinsic risk factors and find empirically valid ways of reducing, if not eliminating, ideally we'd eliminate, but reducing the prevalence of these risk factors so that more of the population will survive into later life. That has been that is the first stage of the journey through the ocean of longevity, represented by the war against disease. But it's only half of the story, because our risk of disease and death is also influenced by our biology and the intrinsic risk factors. Right? So it was not until the middle of the 20th century that Watson and Crick published the paper on the double helix in Nature, and then the sequencing of the human genome towards the end of the 20th century. And basically a broader Darwinian-based approach to medical science that understands that our vulnerability to disease is influenced by our evolutionary history. And in order to open our eyes to the intrinsic risk factors, we need to transcend some of the folkbiological premises of early public health pioneers. There's been a growing movement among many scientists for advocating for better education in medical science on what is referred to as Darwinian medicine. And in particular, I think translational gerontology is critical to this. There's a couple of great books that I'll list in a moment on this topic, but here's two great passages. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And Mayer's claim that no biological problem is fully solved until both the proximate and evolutionary causation has been elucidated, right? So the early public health pioneers were only functioning really with half of the toolbox, the fixation on the proximate causation of disease, without a fuller understanding of the evolutionary or ultimate causation of disease. And that's really critical for promoting health in an aging world. So here's three excellent books on this topic of Darwinian-based approach to medicine. Why We Get Sick by Randolph Nesse and George Williams. Cancer, The Evolutionary Legacy by Mel Greaves. And then an edited volume, Evolution in Health and Disease by Stephen Stearns and Jacob Coella. All right, so let me unpack very briefly the distinction between approximate versus an evolutionary explanation. And I'm doing this for the purpose of building up to explaining why do we age, right? Why does aging exist for sexually reproducing species? It's a solution to the problem of death. So let's start off by unpacking the distinction between approximate and an evolutionary explanation. And the example I'll give is a crying baby from this piece in the Perspectives on Psychological Science. So, we have a little baby. Let's call the baby Irwin. Irwin is crying, right? And maybe you say, like, why is Irwin crying? And there's different types of explanations you can give as to why Irwin is crying. Usually when people say, why is the baby crying? They're looking for what's called the proximate explanation. So the proximate explanation looks at the mechanisms that underpin the trait. What's the immediate causal trigger, right? So maybe 5 minutes ago, baby Irwin was quiet. There was no sound. You're like, I can rest. And now you hear the baby crying, and there's going to be a reason, something that caused, right? So maybe he's woken up because he's hungry. It's time for the next feeding. Or his blanket has fallen off. He's chilly, and so he's calling out. And by crying, he's bringing a loving caregiver to him to satisfy whatever need he has. So that is the proximate explanation, and that is the one that we are most familiar with when we navigate the world, when we think about disease, right? So let's say uncle diagnosed with lung cancer, and somebody says, well, why did uncle get lung cancer? And it's like, well, he smoked for 50 years, and smoking contributes to the risk factor for certain types of lung cancer. So, oh yeah, maybe if he didn't smoke, he wouldn't have gotten it. Not that it's guaranteed he wouldn't have gotten lung cancer. There are other variants of lung cancer that are not caused by smoking, but that's the way in which we tend to think when we're thinking about the proximate explanation. But there's also an evolutionary explanation, right? Why is it that not only does Irwin cry when he's hungry, but all babies cry when they're hungry or when they have some unmet needs? And so if we ask, but why is it crying? Why don't they just wink their eyes when they're cold? Why is it, why is it an auditory response? Well, when we're doing the evolutionary explanation, we're appealing to the fitness benefits of the trait, right? Crying behavior is an adaptive trait, right? Maybe if we went back tens of thousands of years ago, there were some babies who blinked their eyes when they were hungry and cold, and were those that cried. And over time, right, unless you happen to be standing over your baby watching their eyes, when they're blinking, their needs are not going to be met, right? So they're unlikely to survive to the same degree as those who have the much more effective strategy of belting out aloud, and looking very distressed to trigger the emotional response and the kind of anxiety that all new parents have in getting to their child and placating them to address their needs. And so the babies that cried were much more likely to survive and propagate. And those that did blinking or some other strategy for getting their needs met, unfortunately, did not have the same kind of reproductive success. And so most babies communicate their needs through crying behavior, which is why it's so common. So that is the difference between the evolutionary. When we're looking at the evolutionary explanation, we're looking for the ultimate causation as to why that trait exists. And usually the argument is around it's an adaptation that is conducive to reproductive success. However, it gets a little tricky when we turn to aging and disease. Not everything is necessarily an adaptation, even though there may be other adaptations in the background, and this is really important when we turn to disease. So Darwinian selection favors babies who are able to get their needs met over those that are less capable of doing so. And so most babies will cry when in distress, and that helps to improve their survival. But does this mean that the chronic diseases common in late life, like cancer, and aging itself are adaptations? And here the answer is clearly no. There's a great book by Randolph Nesse on good reasons for bad feelings. And he notes how in earlier work, he presumed that there had to be some view of diseases as an adaptation. And he came to realize that this is mistaken. It's not that the diseases are adaptations. It's just they may be a byproduct of something else that actually is an adaptation. But these chronic diseases in later life and aging itself are not adaptations. There are many evolutionary explanations for aging. The dominant one is what's referred to as the disposable soma theory. It's kind of like a trade-off between reproduction and survival of the parent. Natural selection favors a strategy in which reproduction is made a higher biological priority in terms of the utilization of resources than the somatic maintenance needed for indefinite survival. Another way of describing this is, the force of evolution by natural selection declines with age. So if you just think about the genes implicated in cancer, there are some childhood cancers that have a genetic component, but they're very rare. And those children will die before the age of reproduction, which is why it would be very rare. But if you have cancer genes that don't manifest in disease until after age 60, it makes no impact on reproductive success. So they're going to be much more common. And Huntington's disease was one of those, this is where it was first theorized, that because the symptoms of Huntington's disease are not manifest in the first 40 years of life, it wouldn't really adversely impact reproduction. And so, there's a 50% chance that a parent with the HD, with Huntington's disease, will pass on the mutation to a child. But it declines, the force of evolution by natural selection declines. And so as people get past age 70, we find the onset of these diseases very common. And so one way of conceptualizing is say that aging is the product of evolutionary neglect. It's just what is prioritized is health during the stage of time you're most likely to be alive in our ancestral past, and investing in reproduction, raising and rearing of children. And so health during the reproductive period of the lifespan is what served the species well, but staying healthy at age 80 and 90, would have come at the cost of something else, health in earlier life. And so because the force of evolution by natural selection declines, we find the onset of these conditions more prevalent after the age of 70. Another useful way of characterizing it is to see aging as the shadow of developmental growth, right? So what is prioritized is health and vitality during the stage of the lifespan when the goal of reproduction is most likely to be done. But a consequence of that is that eventually in later life, the onset of our vulnerability to disease, frailty, and disability becomes more prevalent. In an earlier video, I described how the Geroscience hypothesis, the conjecture that you can intentionally modulate the rate of aging, had a century of experimental research behind it, which is now creating a reality that it's moving from the bench to the clinic. And I surveyed how through the era of dietary restriction, first in rodents, it became clear that you could significantly increase lifespan and health span through dietary restriction. And then in the 80s and 90s, the era of genetic manipulation of mice, yeast, fruit flies, and worms. And now we are in the era of pharmacological and pharmaceutical interventions to test in humans. And so this is still in the early stage of development, but it's made the reality that the ideal of rate control can be a feasible aspiration for aging populations in the 21st century. So that concludes this second video on the Chapter 5, Public Health Must Transcend Folkbiology. And the third and final video for this chapter, I'm going to look at the belief that the rate of biological aging is universal. And this has really profound significance for what the aspirations of medical science in the 21st century ought to be.